Welcome back to the podcast, Unbinding the Bible. This week's episode, by the book, Fight Like Jesus. And on the podcast this week, I would like to share with you a conversation that I had with Jason Porterfield on his new book, Fight Like Jesus, How Jesus Waged Peace Throughout Holy Week. And as we are, in fact, approaching Holy Week in the church calendar, I thought this would be an excellent time to release this conversation. Jason's book, as the subtitle implies, is a close-up examination, not just of Holy Week in general, but of each day of Holy Week, starting with Palm Sunday, which we are about ready to celebrate in the church calendar this coming Sunday, and then looking at Holy Monday, and Holy Tuesday, and Holy Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and then, of course, Easter Sunday, and recognizing, as Jason will explain in our conversation, how Jesus's means and Jesus's ways of making peace were at odds with his own people's expectations and desires for how peace is made, but are oftentimes still at odds with even the way Christians approach peacemaking. And so Jason's book is outstanding. And we actually had this conversation before Lent began. And after reading his book and then rereading it, it occurred to me that it might be beneficial in our church if I were to take each day of Holy Week and use the Sundays that are throughout the Lenten season and actually preach each day using Jason's book as a guide for our time in Lent. And I think there was a point in the conversation where I even said to him, hey, I'm thinking about doing this. This might be an idea. Well, I have been doing that in our church. And this week, while we are celebrating Palm Sunday, we have actually made it now all the way to Friday. And so we'll be looking at the crucifixion itself and what that means for our world. And so it's gone really well in our church. I'm very excited about the insights that Jason provides. This book is very, very accessible for just about anyone to pick up and read. And yet Jason has looked at the cultural context, historical context. He's brought in Greek lessons that you can follow along and understand, particularly as it relates to Jesus's use of a whip in the temple on Holy Monday, and how, based upon the Greek usage that John employs in chapter 2, we get a very clear picture of exactly what Jesus was using that whip for in the temple, regardless of the way it's sometimes interpreted. And so I'll let Jason, throughout our conversation, talk to you about these things. I do think we actually make it through all 7 days, which was lots of fun. It's a little over an hour long. But I just want to introduce you to Jason with a bio that he has, and that is that he's made his home in places abandoned by society, from Canada's poorest neighborhood to the slums of Indonesia. His passion is to cultivate God's shalom wherever it is painfully absent, and to help churches embrace their peacemaking vocation. In 2007, Jason joined Servants, an international network of Christian communities living and ministering among the urban poor. He was a founding member of the Servants team in Vancouver, started a new team in Indonesia, and directed operations in North America through 2015. Jason holds a Master of Theology from Fuller Theological Seminary and is the author of Fight Like Jesus, an award-winning book that equips readers with practical peacemaking skills as it examines how Jesus waged peace on each day of Holy Week. Today, you'll find Jason living in his riskiest location yet, next door to his in-laws. And this conversation was a lot of fun. I have come to really appreciate Jason and his work, and his book, Fight Like Jesus, I have recently added, along with Matt Tebby's book, Having the Mind of Christ, to my reading list that several of you had requested a copy of months ago. And so Fight Like Jesus is now on that list as being books that I would highly recommend anybody to jump into and read. And so as you approach Holy Week, if you're listening to these in real time, this will serve as a bit of a guide for you. And each day that you approach Holy Week, you might go back and re-listen to the little section where we talk about that chapter of Jason's book, which is in fact dedicated toward each day. And I pray that this Holy Week will be transformational for you, will be meaningful and powerful in a way that you might have never considered before. I am grateful to Jason for all of the insights that I have now gained in my own life and how perfectly they fit with so many other things that God's been teaching me. But it really feels like so many of those things have come together into one condensed understanding that Jesus's ways of making peace are radically different from the peacemaking approaches that people have in this world, which is why I'm really convinced when Jesus told Pilate, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would be fighting to prevent my arrest by the Jews, but as it is, my kingdom is from another place." And I'm really convinced that the church today desperately needs Jesus's view of peacemaking, Jesus's view of shalom, and how that is accomplished and how that is maintained, and why that is supposed to be the spirit that captures the hearts of Christians to such an extent that it literally will look like foolishness to the rest of the world. And I consider it an honor to wear a badge of shame and foolishness in the name of Christ. And I pray that you will be encouraged by this conversation such that you will start to think, maybe we need to rethink the way we approach everything. So I'm excited about this conversation, really grateful to Jason. And so without any more of me rambling and having an introduction, I offer to you the conversation I have with Jason Porterfield. Thank you so much, Jason, for coming on the podcast today. I'm really glad that we have a chance to sit down and talk about your book.
Yeah, thanks, Joshua. It's an honor to be here with you today.
Well, for my own benefit and then for our listeners, I'd really love it if we could just jump right in and have you tell us a little bit about yourself. And I guess maybe if you could tie that in a little bit into what inspired you to write Fight Like Jesus.
Sure. So I grew up in a military family, so I think I lived in 8 places by the time I was 6, but we eventually settled in Pennsylvania, where I attended a Southern Baptist church that, a wonderful congregation. People dearly loved Jesus and dearly loved the Bible. And so really appreciated that upbringing. It was a pretty conservative, patriotic upbringing, a number of military bases around the church. And then in college, I went to a school called Messiah College, or now Messiah University, that historically was founded by the Brethren in Christ denomination, so Anabaptist. And it was there that I began to grapple, honestly, mostly outside of the classroom with my peers, but began to grapple with, what is it? What did Jesus mean when he said, "Love your enemies," and issues of violence and war and injustice and poverty? 9/11 happened my freshman year, so that really shaped my whole college experience for my classmates and I. Um, One formative event was actually, I think it was my junior year. You had mandatory chapels a couple times a week that you go to, and so I dragged myself to chapel, and it was a guest speaker that day, and he got up and he said something like, "I grew up Amish, but God has called me to minister in the city of Philadelphia. For the first time in history, more people live inside of cities than outside of them. But in my city, the city of brotherly love, as soon as Christians can get enough money, they're fleeing to the suburbs." And I remember him saying, "This is a tragedy." And as I sat in the gym bleachers there listening to him, I thought I was just kind of making an observation, but I guess I didn't articulate it clearly enough, because it seems God thought I was volunteering. I remember saying to God, "Well, God, if you could use an Amish guy, you could use me, a suburban boy." And I kid you not, like as soon as chapel ended, like I'm trying to squeeze through the back doors and rush to class with all the other students, right? And my friend, a friend of mine, Stephanie, she bumped into me, and she, out of breath, she says, "Jason, I just signed you up to lead a spring break mission trip to Camden, New Jersey. It's officially ranked the worst city in the United States. I know God is calling you to this, so don't try to back out." I, I was, flabbergasted. And of course, I tried to back out. So I went to the missions hub called the Agape Center on campus. And I said, look, there's some mistake. I didn't actually sign myself up for this. So then they guilt tripped me, Joshua, and they said, look, we got 9 freshmen signed up. We need an upperclassman to drive the van. If you don't go and lead the trip, we'll have to cancel and they'll have to find something else to do for spring break. So sure enough, a few weeks later, I'm driving a group of college students to Camden. And there, I had never seen such poverty and such what I would call environmental racism. Just so
Mm.
many polluting factories dumping pollution into these predominantly African American and Hispanic neighborhoods. But I also saw something in Camden that just forever changed my life. And it was a community of Christians who had all left good paying jobs and moved to what was probably the roughest intersection of Camden. And there they were just shining the love of Christ. And so after that week, I left Camden thinking. I remember Mother Teresa's famous line was often in my mind back then, and people would often ask if they could come join her in Calcutta. Sometimes she'd say yes, but often she'd say, Calcuttas are everywhere. If you only have eyes to see, find your Calcutta. And that's what I felt
Mm.
like God was saying to me. The Camden, New Jerseys of the world are everywhere. Find your Camden. So a couple years after college, I joined an international network of Christian communities called Servants. And Servants was started by a man out of New Zealand in the early 1980s. And he was really burdened by the number of people living in slums. 1 in 6 people on earth live in urban slums. And so historically, servants communities have all lived and ministered in the slums of Southeast Asia, but they were having growing interest from North Americans like myself. And so they decided to start a community that could kind of also function as a sending hub. And so they chose to set up a community in Canada's poorest urban neighborhood. It's a section of Vancouver known as the Downtown East Side. So January 1st, 2007, I moved to the Downtown East Side. And that's really where the story begins for this book.
Wow. Yeah. And so, I mean, and so that's what you're doing. You're still involved in that kind of ministry today, right?
So I'm not in Vancouver. The goal from the start, really, with moving to Vancouver, was to get mentored by one of the other families there who had been in Cambodia in Phnom Penh for about
Hmm.
10 years, and they're now back in Cambodia. And the hope was to form a new community to start to find a slum to move into in Indonesia. And so after 3 years in Vancouver, we had enough people together to start that community in Jakarta, the capital city. And that community is still there by God's grace. But then I came back and oversaw the sending office. And now I live down in Houston, Texas, and just a really active board member for servants.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. Wow. So you said, yeah, that's kind of the backstory, and so you're able to, as I read numerous times in your book, you're identifying things that you see in the cities or in places, and then you're applying these principles of Jesus's ways of making peace, which I found incredibly insightful. I mean, things that you're just stating as such plain observations, and I'm like, oh my goodness, that's so true. Why have I never thought about it like that before? Um, so how is your book different from other Christian books on peacemaking or nonviolence?
Sure. Well, I believe you're in the middle, right, of a podcast series looking at the Sermon on the Mount. Is that
That's
correct?
right. Yep,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Uh, you know, I think most books on peacemaking tend to focus on the Sermon on the Mount, and that's for good reason. That sermon contains the core of Jesus's peace teaching. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you, bless those who curse you. Do not violently resist an evil person, turn the other cheek, right?
Right.
The problem for me when I moved into the downtown east side in Canada was I could quote that teaching verbatim. I just didn't know how to apply it, especially in the
Hmm.
complexity and the messiness of that neighborhood. You know, on any given night, 5,000 of my neighbors in the downtown east side were struggling with addictions to drugs. 1,200 were experiencing homelessness, and over 900 women were trapped in prostitution. And like I tell in the opening story of the book, a couple weeks after I arrived, I was blindsided to learn that the trial had just begun for Robert Pickton, the man who is known as Canada's deadliest serial killer. So for over a decade, he'd drive into the downtown east side, pick up one of the women engaged in sex work, take her back to his farm, and kill her. By the time of his arrest, he had butchered and fed to his pigs the bodies of 49 women, almost all from my neighborhood.
Mm.
So, you know, how do I how do I contend for the flourishing of this community? How do I try to cultivate shalom in this place where it's painfully absent? And though I could quote Jesus's peace teaching, I struggle to know how to flesh it out in that neighborhood. And that's the beauty of Holy Week. I one day I had an epiphany. It was Palm Sunday, and I was in church there, pretty burnt out. And the church turned the day into a joyous occasion like most churches do. The children parade through the sanctuary, we all chant Hosanna, all the songs are suddenly in a major key. Everyone was just celebratory, except for me. I was burnt out, I was crushed and burdened by the brokenness of my neighborhood. And so I just decided to open the Gospels and read their accounts of Palm Sunday. And that's when I noticed something I had overlooked every other time I'd read the Gospels. And that's in the Gospel of Luke, it says, while the crowds were shouting cheers, that Jesus was shedding tears. And when he could hold back his grief no more, he cries out for everyone to hear, if only you knew on this of all days the things that make for peace. And Joshua, that was the cry of my heart, right? Like, what
Hmm.
are the
Yeah.
things that make for peace? And so the reason this book's different than other books on peacemaking, and the reason I felt compelled to write it, was because I needed a resource that showed how Jesus fleshed out his peace teaching. And that's the beauty of Holy Week. It's the main stage on which we get to see Jesus put all of his previous peace teaching into action. A third of the Gospels focus on Jesus's last week. And so throughout those days, we get to see formally abstract principles like be merciful. They find concrete expression, or those lofty ethical ideals like love your enemies, they become grounded in actual events. And so, like I say in the book, if you want to learn how Jesus makes peace, there's no better place to look than Holy Week. So the book goes day by day through excuse me, through Holy Week, extracting peacemaking lessons for us as it looks at how Jesus contended for peace on each day.
Yeah, and this was fantastic. I first of all, I love the way you set the book up, where each chapter is a different day of Holy Week, which I think is an outstanding way to look at this. And I'm an Anglican priest, and in our tradition, we don't meet as often as some traditions do, but we have Palm Sunday, and then we do Maundy Thursday service, Good Friday
Mhm.
service, and then Easter Sunday. So we have a few more than my Baptist church did growing up. Then it's just Palm Sunday and then Easter. But and you identified this too, is that most books on Holy Week, most church traditions tend to focus on the second half of the week. But why is it that you dedicate so much of your book to the first half of Holy Week? Could you dive into that for us a little bit?
Sure. I mean, the short answer is I did that because that's what the gospel writers do. They front load their coverage of Holy Week. So pop quiz for your listeners. Joshua, you'll know the answer to this since you read the book, but for your listeners, take a second and guess, which day of Holy Week do you think is the most talked about day in the Gospels? Is it Palm Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Maundy, Thursday, Good Friday, Saturday, Easter Sunday? I probably would have guessed Friday or Sunday, or if I
Yeah.
really sat and thought about it for a long time, maybe Maundy, Thursday, because of that lengthy farewell discourse that's recorded. But the most talked about day is actually Tuesday of Holy Week. I mean, Matthew actually has more to say about that day than all the other days of Holy Week combined. It's
Oh wow.
twice as long as his coverage of the Sermon on the Mount. Um, and so, to give a more lengthy answer as to why I tried to take my time with those first days of Holy Week is, I believe that lament on Palm Sunday when Jesus said, if only you knew the things that make for peace. By speaking of things in the plural, he indicated that his peacemaking efforts would be multifaceted in nature. We can't reduce it to one solitary act. I used to think I knew what Jesus was referring to with that lament. I mean, the answer was obvious. It's the cross, right? Um, and I still believe that answer is true. I mean, it's wonderfully true, beautifully true, foundationally true. It's just not the whole truth. And I've come to see that Jesus was crucified on Friday precisely because of how he confronted injustice and contended for peace on the previous days of Holy Week.
Mm.
And it wasn't a motivation to initially start writing the book, but pretty quickly I came to realize that if we fail to see uh, the context of the cross, if we strip the cross from its context, we uproot it from its context, we sever it from the life of the one who gives it meaning, then we could actually, despite being familiar with all the events of Holy Week, and despite saying that we cling to the cross of Christ for our salvation, we may be shocked one day to realize that we've actually embraced the very approach to peacemaking that justified nailing Jesus to a cross.
Mm.
And so for me, it was really important to make sure I did justice and gave enough time for those first 4 or 5 days of Holy Week.
Yeah, well, that's probably one of the biggest insights I walked away with, having read through your book, and I've read it twice now. I'm actually considering doing kind of an overview of your book throughout Lent in our church. I've been thinking about preaching the Palm Sunday on the first Sunday in Lent, and then Monday on the second Sunday in Lent, and going on that way,
Yeah, yeah.
crediting your book, but kind of trying to tie it together. And again, I know we don't have time to hit every passage that could be addressed, but addressing that question. And if Jesus was put to death on Friday for the things that he did during Holy Week, then we need to make sure we are, well, as your Palm Sunday chapter focuses on the difference between hammers and lambs. And
Yeah.
so, if you could talk for us just a little bit, if you're saying, well, the crowd is cheering, Jesus is weeping. If there's a contrast there between maybe what the crowd was rooting for and hoping for and what Jesus actually knew he has come to do. Um, it seems like the crowd wanted him to be the hammer of God, but he revealed himself to be the Lamb of God. So could you unpack that observation for us a little bit and walk us through some of that discrepancy on Palm Sunday?
You bet. Yeah. So, first, I think we need to realize that the week that we call Holy Week, Jesus and his contemporaries would have referred to as Passover. All faithful Jews were flooding to Jerusalem, Jerusalem, Shalom, the city whose name means peace. They were gathering there to celebrate the week-long Passover festivities. And Passover was a holy week to remember the time that God liberated his people from an oppressive superpower, originally Egypt, right? Well, for people struggling under the yoke of yet another oppressive superpower, this time Rome, Passover was a painful reminder that they were no longer free. And so, year after year, they'd gathered together to remember God's historic liberation from Egypt, of them from Egypt. And year after year, they longed that he would liberate them once again. So the week actually had a track record of inciting all-out insurrection. In 4 BC, for example, a group of frustrated Jews gathered recruits in the temple and stoned to death some Roman soldiers. So then Herod Archelaus gathered together more troops and quickly rushed into the city, killed 3,000 Jews, and canceled that year's Passover. And as a result of that, Rome actually made a new policy that said their ruler over the province had to be in Jerusalem for Passover and had to bring reinforcements. So on this particular Passover, the one that we're looking at, the provincial ruler Pontius Pilate left his home on the coast of the Mediterranean and marched what scholars think he brought enough troops to triple the number of troops normally in Jerusalem. And he would have marched with a massive show of force meant to try to deter any thought of rebellion, right? And his triumphal entry, we could call it, would have come in through the western side of the city. But we read that Jesus and his motley crew are making a not so triumphal entry from the other side of the city, and that the crowds go out to meet him, we're told, because they heard he had raised Lazarus from the dead. So here's a man that can control death itself. Maybe he has more power than Pontius Pilate. And so to understand Jesus's actions with his triumphal entry, you first need to understand what the crowd's actions signify. So the Gospels they describe the crowds doing four different things. First of all, they chant Hosanna, which I just thought was a synonym of like hallelujah, like it means praise God or something. But Hosanna, it's actually the Aramaic form of a two-part Hebrew word, Hoshea and Na. And Hoshea means liberate us, save us, deliver us. And Na just adds a sense of urgency. So fuse those two together and you get, liberate us now, save us, we plead, deliver us, we pray. It's a cry for help.
Hmm.
They also quote from Psalm 118, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. But then they add some words not found anywhere in that psalm. The King of Israel. They call Jesus their king. It says they also lay their coats on the ground, which might seem strange to you and I, but for Jesus's coatless onlookers, they knew exactly what that meant. That was a customary way to coronate a king. That's what they did when Jehu was crowned king in 2 Kings chapter 9, for example. And then there's one more detail. Gospel of John tells us that they waved palm branches. And I always thought palm branches were like the ancient equivalent of those giant foam hands you see at sporting events. Like I thought
Yeah.
waving them meant like, you're awesome, Jesus. I'm your number one fan. You're my religious hero. Um, but they actually, palm branches were a politically loaded symbol. That harkened back 200 years ago, actually, when the people of Judea were under the thumb of yet another superpower, the Seleucid Empire. And their king came in and he ransacked the temple, slaughtered an unclean pig on the altar, and sprinkled its blood throughout the temple. And then he ordered all the towns of Judea to offer sacrifices to his gods and sent inspectors to make sure they did so. Well, there was a little town called Modine that had an elderly priest named Mattathias. And when the king's inspector came, one of Mattathias's fellow countrymen actually volunteered to offer the sacrifice to those gods. Well, Mattathias, in his zeal, lunged forward and he stabbed the apostate to death, killed the king's inspector, tore down the altar, and then he fled to the hills. And soon after, his health deteriorated, and he gathered his 5 sons around him. And his dying words to them were, avenge the wrong done to your people, pay back the Gentiles in full. His middle son, Judas, took up that battle cry and led a pretty successful revolt against the Seleucids and actually gained back most of Jerusalem, including the temple. And we read as he made his triumphal entry on a war horse into Jerusalem and then proceeded to cleanse the temple, that the crowds lined his path and waved palm branches. And in fact, when they thought we're going to get our independence, they started to mint their own coins. And on the coin, they put a palm tree and encircled it with the battle cry for the redemption of Zion. And we know that the palm branch remained the symbol of the Jewish people's nationalist aspirations, because even a couple decades after Jesus, there was the Jewish-Roman War, and at that time, once again, the Jewish people started to mint their own coins, and once again, they put the palm branch as their symbol. So, in other words, when the crowds were waving palm branches, they were they were demonstrating their desire to be liberated, and what's more, waving them at Jesus meant that they thought he would be their liberator. So that's what the crowds thought Jesus was doing. And I should add that Judas, the middle son of Mattathias, he was so fierce in battle that his countrymen gave him the nickname Maccabeus, which means the hammer. So you're asking about the hammer. So in other words, the crowds thought Jesus was coming as the hammer of God to bring a hammer down upon their enemies.
Mm-hmm.
But Jesus, he sets up his not so triumphal entry, his counter procession, to demonstrate that he was not the hammer of God. He was coming as something else. So first he rode a donkey instead of a war horse, a symbol of peace, and John's gospel explicitly tells us he rode that donkey to fulfill Zechariah's vision from chapter 9 of a peaceable king who would come to speak peace to all nations and, get this, remove the weapons of war from his own people.
Mm.
Uh,
Wow.
and then the timing and the location are also significant. Jesus entered Jerusalem on the first day of Passover, a Sunday, probably the year 30 AD. But more importantly, we know it was the 10th day of the Jewish month of Nisan, which, according to Mosaic law, was the day when all the Passover pilgrims were to choose their lamb that they would sacrifice 4 days later. It was lamb selection day. We also know those lambs were, almost all of them were provided from Bethlehem. And Jesus's route, going down the Mount of Olives, crossing the Kidron Valley, would have then lined up with the route that the sheep would have been taking. And Jesus almost certainly entered through what was known as the sheep gate. So, in other words, Jesus is subtly, yes, but unambiguously declaring, I'm not coming as the hammer of God, I'm coming as the Lamb of God.
Wow. Man, that's beautiful. That's beautiful. And so for sure when we know that imagery, I mean, like a lamb led to the slaughter, he did not open his mouth. I mean, there's so much of this innocent, humble
Yeah.
posture that Jesus takes. In fact, I think you said also in that chapter that during Passover, then for the next 4 days, the families were to inspect their lamb thoroughly to make sure that it was without spot or blemish at all. And we can kind of map that onto Jesus's life and suggest that over the next several days, he too is being critiqued at every turn. Is he really the spotless, unblemished lamb that we need him to be? And
Yeah.
that I think is really what launches in, because having a book on peacemaking is so refreshing, but there was so much conflict during Jesus's final week, and some of which he instigates, and some of the time it's the religious leaders or the Sanhedrin who's coming to him and challenging some of the things that he's doing. Um, but so let's just, I mean, we've got some time. Let's walk through the next day. So I think right off the bat, you point out how on the very next day, Monday, we might almost be confronted with the very thing that would seem to upend this idea that Jesus has come peaceably or like a lamb, because he walks into a temple and he has a whip, and depending on what gospel you're reading, you can't quite exactly tell who he's whipping and what he's doing there. But could you kind of unpack that for us and show or explain how you actually see this advancing Jesus's understanding of making peace, not actually contradicting it?
Yeah, I didn't write this book for it to be apologetic in nature, in the sense of trying to defend or answer the objections of those who don't hold to a nonviolent peacemaking ethic. But it's interesting that a couple of the passages that uh, is often brought up against nonviolent peacemaking are events that took place during Holy Week. One of those being what's referred to as the cleansing of the temple on Monday. And so it can seem like a very confusing passage. I just mentioned he rode a donkey to fulfill Zechariah's vision, where it says he'll remove the weapons of war from his own people. But the very next day, he's picking up a weapon, it seems, right? Um,
Yeah.
and it doesn't help that pretty much every artistic rendering of this event depicts Jesus using the whip on people. Um, and the result of that, this portrayal, is that many Christians have found a convenient way to justify their own violent intentions. um, if Jesus hurt people with a whip, then under the right conditions, his followers may also use force. At least that's the argument. Of course, those conditions are never identified. Instead, Christians divorce Jesus' actions from what actually were the issues that upset him on that day. And also, by classifying the whip as a weapon, many Christians have concluded that any weapon can be used, even ones that are
Mm.
infinitely more lethal and indiscriminate than a whip. So it's very much a problematic text. I mean, Saint Bernard of Clairvaux in the Second Crusades told the Knights Templar, "Repel the foes of Christ, for our Savior armed his most holy hands with a whip." Even John Calvin used this passage to justify having a theological opponent of his put to death. Um, so, like you said, I didn't want to just neutralize what some see as a toxic text or a problematic text. I wanted to show how it actually advances our understanding of peacemaking. Um, there's probably not enough time to go through the whole chapter. It's a pretty long chapter, but But in essence, the Gospels actually divide that event into three stages, and the first stage actually occurs the night before. It's um, the last thing we read about Palm Sunday is that Jesus enters the city, he goes into the temple, and he looks around, and then it says he returns to Bethany for the night. That's a town about 2 miles outside of Jerusalem. And so you might think nothing important happened there, but I think this was actually Jesus was assessing the situation. Something he saw bothered him deeply, but instead of just snapping and responding then and there, he actually has the whole night to think about what he saw, to pray about it, and to figure out how he would respond. So only one gospel mentions Jesus using a whip, John's gospel. And so I really slow down at the second stage, the action itself, right? And look at, what does John say about the whip? Does it say he whipped people or just the animals? And there's a number of clues or variables to consider, such as John's gospel explicitly states that Jesus made the whip once he was already in the temple, and it tells us the material he used. It's like a wicker material, like a wicker basket. It was, the prevailing theory is it was the bedding used for the animals there. Um, and so this is not a well-designed instrument of torture, made by a skilled craftsman with plenty of time and ideal materials. This is a makeshift whip, hastily put together from a limited selection of materials. Um, and I actually, when I saw what the material was, I went, like any millennial, I went to Amazon. I bought a 200-foot roll, free 2-day shipping. It was a miracle, I thought. Hit buy, and then immediately felt guilty for supporting Jeff Bezos. I get it. It arrives. The kids and I, we watch Indiana Jones, and we take our time trying to make the most intimidating whip we could. And I couldn't make anything that looked intimidating. Like, if I tried to whip people with this, instead of fleeing in fear, they would have fallen on the ground laughing. And the earliest manuscripts, the two earliest manuscripts we have for the Gospel of John, they actually include the little Greek word hos, which means to approximate something. So it's used when it talks about Jesus sweating something like blood, for example, in the garden. So these are pseudo whips, something like a whip, which would be a good description of the whips that I tried to make that day. They kind of resembled a whip. And we actually know from ancient sources that whips like this were actually used to herd cattle back then, not even by hitting them, but by whacking the ground to make a loud noise. Um, so there's that evidence, right? There's other factors, like we know that Roman soldiers were stationed in the fortress next door that actually had a tower that looked down into the temple. So if Jesus turned violent, it's hard to explain why they and the temple security didn't intervene.
Mm.
But ultimately, it comes down to the Greek. What does John actually say? And so I look, the key verse, if I remember right, it's John 2:15. It might be 14 though. And it says, and making a whip out of cords, he drove from the temple all. And then it has this phrase, to the sheep, kai the cattle. And kai just means and to usually just means so. It's like a logical connector kind of word. But that phrase, to the sheep, kai the cattle, this construction of to a noun, kai a noun, it's used 90 times in the New Testament. Once here in John chapter 2, 89 times elsewhere. And in every other instance, it's translated into English as telling us what the noun it modifies is constructed of. So in this case, he drove out of the temple all. What was the all made up of? It was made up of the sheep and the cattle. And there's actually 13 of those 90 instances are just like in John 2, where it's the word all and then a to noun, kai noun construction. All, both Jews and Greeks. That's to Jews, kai the Greeks. And so it's always telling us what the all consists of, what it's made up of. So some have tried to translate it as he drove out of the temple all along with the sheep and the cattle, which would mean that he whipped the money changers and the animal sellers. But a number of scholars who have looked at the canonical usage of this phrase and how it's used outside of the Bible, even at that time, has said it's impossible to translate it that way. Um, so, at best, that neutralizes the text. And what I go on to say is, well, what does this actually teach us about peacemaking? Um, and I tell a story. I won't go into that here, but basically, I think the point is it shows that Jesus was not passive in the face of injustice. In other words, he didn't sit by and do nothing, right? When he saw the exploitative practices of the money changers and animal sellers, when he saw how the foreigners were being corralled within the court of the Gentiles, this court that was not originally part of the blueprint for the temple, um, he he had to act. He had to respond. Gandhi referred to Jesus as the most active resistor of injustice in human history, and I think that's what we learn from the temple cleansing scene.
Wow. Yeah, that's so beautiful. And I think you made a comment in your book itself about the fact that if he makes a whip in that moment and he drives the animals out, then the money changers are going to go run after their investment and leave the temple as well.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
you said something kind of tongue in cheek, like, killing two birds with one stone. But the idea being right, I mean, he's going to drive them out because what they need to make money has just left the building. So, um, which I mean, I see that at, you've taken the time to look at this from so many different angles. I had never considered the Romans themselves, who are constantly on the lookout for anything hinting at violence because they're there to make sure that doesn't happen. And so, um, certainly, we can imagine they would have stopped it if something truly violent was taking place.
yeah.
Um,
I
well,
mean,
let's roll. Yeah, go
come
ahead.
Thursday, not even Jesus' accusers, when they're looking for some false evidence to accuse him to justify putting him to death, if he had acted violently in the temple, surely they would have brought that up. So there's lots of other evidence, and um, you could say, well, what did it accomplish? I don't talk about this in the book, but certainly by the very next day, those money changers and animal sellers would have been back in the temple, and the
Mhm.
operations would have continued, right? But I think that shows the importance of symbolic acts. We're still talking about what Jesus did that day, right?
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
and when those money changers and the animal sellers, when they fled after their livelihood, after their source of income, what we overlook and don't talk about enough is that it says that the poor and the lame and the blind, they came in and Jesus healed them, and even children could be heard singing. These groups that were not normally allowed in the temple. So it was a profoundly healing and beautiful act.
absolutely. Yeah, it was so funny. This happened half a dozen or more times. You would write something in the book and quote the passage, and I would say, Are you serious? Is that really what it says?" And I'd go grab my Bible, and sure enough, that one in particular was there immediately after that. Yeah, you have all these people coming into the temple who clearly were being prevented from doing so prior to that. So
Yeah,
what a beautiful image, and I really do think we should talk about that more, because those were the very people who were not welcome in the temple. Um,
yeah.
Goodness. Well, if we keep going, I don't know, we'll hit every day here with our last 20 or 25 minutes or so, but
Okay.
the next day, you talked about it's the most talked about day of Holy Week. So can you just kind of give us an overview of the day's events and maybe highlight why do you think we ignore this day, or what can we learn from Jesus from Holy Tuesday?
Yeah. Well, I think we ignore the day because we're on a rush to get to the main event, the
Hmm.
cross, and that's
Yeah.
understandable. But and maybe the other reason is it doesn't contain some of the scenes that take place. They don't have the visuals that can really latch on and stay in our mind, like that triumphal entry of the temple cleansing. It's a lot of dialogue or back and forth conversation. So on Tuesday, Jesus actually has the audacity to go back to the temple. After Monday, it says that the religious leaders were looking for a way to put Jesus to death, and yet here he returns once again. Um, and so this time they take the initiative, and they actually ask a series of beta questions that they think are these unanswerable tests. And the whole point is to drive a wedge between Jesus and his supporters. They're afraid to arrest him because the crowds are on his side.
Hmm.
So they're hoping they can get him to misspeak, and that the crowds will turn on him so they can arrest him. Well, Jesus, of course, ace, aces their unanswerable test. Um, and so after those four questions, one of them being like, is it right to pay the tax to Caesar? Should we pay it or shouldn't we? If he says yes, pay the tax, he's immediately lost favor with the crowds who despise the tax. But if he says no, don't pay the tax, they could arrest him for starting an insurrection, for revolting against Rome. So that's one example, and that's the one of four questions that I look at in that chapter. And then after those four questions, Jesus takes the initiative, and he launches into a lengthy critique that we often call the seven woes. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. Um, and it's a pretty um, direct, maybe you could even say harsh, critique of the religious leaders. And after those seven woes, Jesus leaves the temple, never to return again. And as they're leaving, I think the disciples were relieved. Whoo, Jesus wasn't arrested. We did not think that was going to go well.
Yeah, that's
And
right.
so they're happy, and this is where they say they're looking around at all the big buildings, and they say, "Wow, look at these magnificent buildings! Look at all these massive stones!" And indeed, those stones were massive in size, and Jesus just like just pops the balloon, just deflates, takes all the excitement out of them, and says, do you see these big buildings? Do you see these big stones? Not one of these will stand. They're going to be toppled, destroyed, right? Temple's going to be destroyed. And so the up to that point, the disciples, they seemed really chatty, and then there's nothing recorded. They say nothing until they get to the Mount of Olives and sit down. And from there, you can actually look across the Kidron Valley, and you have this panoramic view of the temple. Um, and it's there that they ask, when will these things happen? And Jesus launches into a pretty lengthy set of teaching and some parables to back it up. But it's often referred to as the little apocalypse, where it talks about nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. But you, in other words, you're not going to be one of those two groups fighting, but you'll be brought before both. You'll be despised by both. Um, so it's a pretty lengthy set of teachings during that day. That's a quick overview for you.
Yeah, that's great. And I know, and I think that's kind of the start too of, yeah, let's test this guy. Let's see what he's really all about. And it was, they thought they were so creative and baiting
Yes.
him with a trap. And of course he gets out of it. And you said the same thing, something about when you try to trap people or trick them. I can't remember exactly how you worded it, but you said there's those kinds of traps are indiscriminate and you can get caught in your own trap if you, it's basically what happens with Jesus.
Yep. They set the trap, and then Jesus tricks them into stepping in it. Yep.
They step in it themselves. Absolutely. Yeah. So then we've got Wednesday, and I know Wednesday. It seems like it's a little quieter of a day, but you did bring up something that I just never thought about before. So it does say that that Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin they meet behind closed doors to plot Jesus's death. But you kind of brought out something that I had not considered before, and that was just, but why did the Sanhedrin want Jesus dead? What is their stated motive in the Gospels?
Yeah. Growing up, I'm not sure I was actually taught this in Sunday school, but just somehow I came to hold the impression that the Sanhedrin, they wanted Jesus dead just because they were the bad guys. They were jealous of his popularity. They were angered that he had just publicly shamed them with those seven woes the days before. They wanted Jesus dead, but that's not actually the stated motive that the Gospels give. Rather, it says that when they met behind closed doors in Caiaphas's home inside the walls of Jerusalem, and this was the Sanhedrin, the ruling council of the Jews, 70 plus one, the one being the high priest, so Caiaphas. And they actually had this really beautiful tradition that they would let the youngest members speak up first, so that way they wouldn't be swayed and influenced by the more tenured members.
Hmm.
So often the high priest would wait toward the end to speak. Um, and so the Sanhedrin, they're complaining. They're saying, look, if we let Jesus continue, like the crowds are coming to his side, and so they were afraid. they said, this man's performing many signs. If we let him go on like this, everyone's going to believe in him. And then the Romans will come and take away both our temple and our nation. And so
Mm,
then Caiaphas finally chimes in, and he basically says, look, you know nothing at all. For it's better that one man die than that a whole nation perish. And, at first glance, Caiaphas's logic, I mean, it seems indisputable. Yeah, one man is not worth as much as an entire nation. And, one of my concerns is I think we still hold to this logic. When I talked about we might cling to the cross of Christ, it embraced the very approach to making and maintaining peace that justified putting Jesus on the cross. This is a classic example of that. We often um, justify the ends using unjust means by imagining a fictional future. Um, so Caiaphas, he concocts this fictional future that Rome will come and take away his nation in order to justify having Jesus put to death. And we do that all the time now. I remember before Beijing really cracked down, um, people were saying, if they have to beat pro-democracy protesters in order to keep China from cracking down, then so be it. The ends justify the means. Or if children have
mm,
to be separated from their parents at the border in order to deter foreigners from flooding into our land, then so be it. The ends justify the means. And if Jesus has to be put to death in order to prevent the destruction of an entire nation, then so be it. The ends justify the means. Um,
mm,
we still live by this logic. But Pastor Brian Zond, he once warned. He said, one of the greatest temptations we face in working for peace is to justify violent means by an imagined good end. Um,
hmm,
and I think Caiaphas is proof that if you give in to that temptation, there's no limit to the atrocities that you might justify. But when you look at Jesus, for Jesus, the means were nothing less than the end coming into existence. In other words, his efforts to make peace were always with peaceful means. I think of
hmm,
Dr. King. He said
mhm,
peace is not merely a distant goal that we seek, but a means by which we arrive at that goal.
mm. Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's really good. I remember reading that section too with the ends justify the means. And I thought, oh my goodness, yeah, this kind of logic has rooted itself deeply into the way that we think. And I know, of course, with Judas, the disciple Judas seems to share some of that because
Hmm.
he eventually does begin to plot with them about how he can be a contributor to that fact. And so on Thursday, and you brought this out, which I found so fascinating. You said Jesus, he sends his couple of his disciples to go prepare an upper room, and it's going to be this like last minute decision about where they're going to celebrate the Passover. And you suggested that part of the reason he does that is because if Judas had known ahead of time where that room would have been, he could have tipped off the authorities and they would have interrupted Jesus's time with his disciples. And so
Yeah.
Jesus is being very just shrewd, and he's like, I've got to spend this time with them. This is the last night we're going to spend together. But you talk a lot about Jesus's command to love one another, and you talk about the communal implications of that, not as an individual precisely, but or in particular, but rather as a community. So, for us as Christians together, why is it so important that we engage in peacemaking as part of a community and not just as individual believers?
Yeah, great question, Joshua. In the downtown east side, I worked hard to try to love my neighbors well and to really invest in them. I'd spend hours most days prayerfully walking the streets, striking up conversations, getting to know my neighbors. I volunteered at a soup kitchen a few mornings each week. I was always looking for an excuse to treat my neighbors and myself to a nice cup of coffee at one of the local coffee shops, or get some sushi. It was like heaven on earth there. You could get sushi cheaper than McDonald's. Um,
Ah, yes.
and but I have to admit, like in all my efforts on my own to be a peacemaker, to work for the flourishing of my neighbors, I saw very little fruit. But like I said at the start, I didn't go there on my own. I was part of a missional community, and we saw our main ministry as that of hospitality, welcoming into our home those who are not normally the recipients of welcome. And as a community, we saw lots of fruit, just beautiful transformations of neighbors getting off of drugs, getting off the streets, uh, graduating from rehab. Some of them joined our community and became just beautiful members. One of them is now a missionary in Cambodia. He's been there for 12 years, um, and um, and so I found myself asking, why this difference? Why did I see such little fruit on my own, yet an abundance of fruit when ministering as part of a community? And so in this chapter, like you talked about, I focused on Jesus's new love command, a new command I give to you, or to you all. It's the word "you" is plural throughout the command. A new command I give to y'all: love each other, just as I have loved y'all. And this is where Maundy Thursday gets its name. It comes from the Latin mandatum, or what we would say mandate, the new mandate. Um, and so I point out, look, this command is new for a couple of reasons. Number one, Jesus uh, has made himself the new standard of love, which is significant in and of itself. But for time's sake, I'm going to move on from that one. But the other reason it's new is because it's the first time that Jesus has called his followers to commit themselves to each other. This is a different command than love your neighbor as yourself. You can do that on your own, and we're called to do that. This is different from love your enemies as well. This is saying, I want you all, you as a community, to commit to loving each other just as I have loved you all. And like I say in the book, really leaning on the teaching of my friend Dave Andrews, who's been involved in missional Christian communities in Australia for almost 50 years. He says, look, one person can talk about the love of God, and others can gather around and listen. And at best, the best possible outcome is they could walk away saying, wow, I've now just heard about God's love. But once you have two people committed to loving each other as Christ has loved them, you have a relationship. Think of like two dots with a line connecting them, right? And others can gather around and look and observe and see how they love each other. And at the best possible outcome is they can walk away saying, now I've not just heard about God's love, I've actually seen God's love.
Hmm.
But something miraculous happens once you add at least one more person. Once you have three people, and maybe picture like a triangle here, right? The number of relationships begins to take off exponentially. So with three people, there's now three relationships. With four people, there's actually six relationships. With five, I think it's 11 relationships, if I remember my math correctly.
Hmm.
It just begins to explode. And the beautiful thing about community, if your listeners picture that triangle again, is now others can come and they can enter into that community and no longer just hear about God's love or see God's love. They can actually experience God's love. And so in the book I say, look, peace, it's always complete in community. On our own, all we can do is talk about peace and demand justice. We see that on Twitter all the time.
Mm-hmm.
But in community, you can actually embody peace and do justice. In community, you can model on a small scale the kind of peace that you're seeking to cultivate on a grand scale.
Wow. Yeah, that was really beautiful. You had some illustrations there of some of those dots and how the relationships multiply exponentially. And I do think that's what we're called to be as a church, is this community of love that embodies Jesus's life amongst ourselves for the benefit of the world.
Yeah.
Um, and so, yeah, that's kind of his high point with his own disciples. And then shortly after that, Judas leaves, and there's the betrayal and the denial, and then we come into to Friday, which I do think, like you said, we might skip over Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, those things because we're eager to get to Friday. But I do want to talk about Friday.
You
What
bet.
some of the things that you say here, but based on Jesus' weeping and the palm branches on Palm Sunday and all of that, is that it really does come down to a choice between Barabbas and Jesus. And you suggest that represents the fundamental decision each of us must make on Friday. So I'd love it if you kind of set it up. You shared a story with a camp speaker at the beginning of the chapter, and some things about a hammer. So maybe just tie some thoughts in there together for us about how you see this being a choice that we still face today.
Yeah, so come Friday, Jesus is brought before Pontius Pilate, and Pilate had a custom, we read, of releasing one prisoner. Probably not because he was a very compassionate provincial ruler. In fact, a lot of sources from the time describe him as cold and calculated, and
Hmm.
indeed, this was probably a calculated decision, a way to placate the crowds, when tensions were high. And so Pilate, well, the Gospels vary. Sometimes it has the crowds initiating it, saying, you have this tradition, we want Barabbas. And some of the other Gospels, Pilate initiates and says, hey, I'm going to release a prisoner. Do you want Jesus or Barabbas? But either way, the choice comes down to these two men. And, I think of like the Christian Kobes Dumay's popular book, Jesus and John Wayne. Well, this was the original Jesus and John Wayne choice,
Yeah.
right?
Yep.
Um, so you can't understand the significance of this choice unless you can really answer two questions. Why was Barabbas in jail? And what's the significance of his name?
Hmm.
So, as to the crime, it doesn't say that Barabbas was in jail for a petty misdemeanor or stealing or tax evasion. Rather, the Gospels explicitly state that Barabbas was in prison because he had murdered someone during a past insurrection attempt. So, in other words, Barabbas had proven his willingness to fight for the liberation of of his people. He may be a failed insurrectionist, but at least he had proven he was willing to bring a hammer down upon his
Hmm.
enemies. Now, his name, let me pronounce it a little differently. Barabbas, Bar Abba, it means son of the Father. And Matthew's gospel actually tells us his first name, Jesus Barabbas. So, in other words, the gospel writers present this choice as the choice of choosing between two different messiahs. Who do you think is anointed by God?
Hmm.
Jesus Barabbas, who has proven that he's willing to kill, or Jesus the Nazarene, who has repeatedly said throughout the week that he refused to kill, but yet was willing to be killed. And so I think, by the time Friday morning rolled around, the crowds realized that Jesus was not coming as the hammer of God. And I think we're supposed to see ourselves in the crowds. And so when we realized that Jesus was not the hammer of God, we picked up the hammer and we nailed Jesus to a cross. And I think it's really important to add, uh, I think we're meant to compare Jesus's dying words to the dying words of Mattathias 200 years before. So, for your listeners, remember Mattathias's dying words were, "Avenge the wrong done to your people, pay back the Gentiles in full." And those dying words, they sparked a violent revolution. But Jesus's dying words could not have been more different.
Hmm.
Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And I think Jesus' dying words also sparked a revolution, albeit a nonviolent one.
Absolutely. Yeah, and that's just when Pilate says, "Who shall I release?" and the people chant for, yeah, the Messiah that they believe will bring them the deliverance. And
Mm-hmm.
what a yeah, I think I grew up with it almost seeing Jesus's death as so orchestrated and driven by God that it was just, it was an inevitability, and you didn't really pay much attention to the reasons that the crowds give or that the reasons the Sanhedrin gives. But your book has tied it together so well to show the real on the ground political implications and the real life. Hey, we're struggling in the inner city. Like, how do we apply Jesus's teachings there? I mean, this is something truly remarkable. Um, well, then we know. I mean, he is put to death, and then Saturday seems to be almost a blip on our screen. We don't talk a lot about that. We don't have a lot in the Gospels about it, but it says you wrote, when you contend for peace in places where it is painfully absent, most days feel like Saturday of Holy Week, silent, confusing, and hopeless. So, what can Saturday teach us about peacemaking?
Yeah. On Saturday, like you said, there's not much in the Gospels or in the New Testament, but there are some hints, some glimpses of what ultimately, like in the Apostles' Creed, it comes to. We refer to it as Jesus's descent into hell or the harrowing of Hades, and throughout church history, this was actually a really important teaching. Christ's descent. The earliest Holy Week hymn we have is about Saturday. Um, and so like the Apostles' Creed, it says, I believe in Jesus Christ, who I'm cutting out some of it here, but who suffered under Pontius Pilate, was crucified, dead, and buried. He descended into hell. On the third day he rose again from the dead. And so um, most artwork in Protestant and evangelical circles, and uh, it tends to depict the resurrection as Jesus in a white robe, all by himself. But throughout Eastern Christendom, most of the artwork it depicts Jesus shattering the gates of hell with Satan bound at his feet. He's pulling Adam and Eve out of their graves and leading a procession of liberated souls out of hell. And so, look, I don't think there's enough in scriptures to develop an in-depth theology of Holy Saturday, but I think there is enough to give us a very valuable peacemaking lesson. Namely, peacemaking, it's hard, discouraging work. The destructive forces plaguing our communities, they can seem unstoppable. But even on days when all hope feels lost, Saturday reminds us that Jesus is at work, robbing the grave and plundering even the darkest of hells. So in the book, I basically say, look, Holy Saturday reminds us to press on. We don't deny the reality of death and suffering around us. Rather, Saturday gives us the courage to remain immersed in such realities. So we press on because Jesus is at work beneath the surface, defeating death, dismantling despair. We press on because the days when Jesus seems most lifeless may actually be the days when he's most actively working for our peace.
Hmm. Yeah, that's really, really good. That's really good. Do you have a couple more minutes or do you need to go?
Sure.
Okay,
No, I can
so
stay.
let's wrap it up with Easter Sunday. I mean, this
Oh, we
is the
got to
last
do that.
one. We
Don't
got to
worry.
do that. And then I just want to, just the biggest takeaway you hope your readers get. But so, your final chapter, you state that as people of the resurrection, Christians are meant to cultivate the future promised by God in the messiness of the here and now. What are the implications as you see them of living like this as people of the resurrection?
Yeah. Well, for first century Jews, most believed in a future resurrection, but they believed it would take place at the end of time when God would make all things right. Not that it would start with one man and break into the messiness of the here and now. And so, to be a people of the resurrection for the early church, they understood that to mean that the resurrection signified the inbreaking of God's future plans into our present world order. And so to be a people of the resurrection meant that we were to be outposts, to use that communal language again from Thursday. The church was to be an outpost of God's future kingdom. I think of Scott McKnight, who penned the foreword for this book. He said, since the kingdom is already making itself present, we are called to live now in light of that future consummation. So, Justin Martyr in the second century, he said about the global church, he said, we ourselves were well conversant with war, murder, and everything evil. But all of us Christians throughout the whole wide earth have traded in our weapons of war. We've exchanged our swords for plowshares and our spears for farm tools. And a lot of people like to quote that statement from Justin Martyr, but they leave off the last sentence where he says, um, now we the church, we cultivate the expectation of the future given to us by the crucified one. In other words, To be a people of the resurrection is to say, because we know there's this vision in the Hebrew scriptures where there will be no more war and we will lay down our weapons, we are going to be the people that begin to live out that future reality now.
Yes. Yes. That is I think that's the thrust of everything you're trying to say in this book is
Mm.
that if we really follow Jesus, we follow his ways. And the one who was raised from the dead is the one who perfectly embodied this. And so that's the new life we're called to live into. So one last question for you, and just that's what's the biggest takeaway you hope readers get from your book?
Yeah, good. That's a great question. Look, you don't have to live in a place like the downtown east side to know that injustice is rampant in our world today. When I started writing this book 5 years ago now, I never could have imagined just how much vitriol and division there'd be in my own country.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so my hope for readers, for your listeners, even if they don't pick up the book, but they just go back to the Gospels and look at each day of Holy Week, is really that I think of Jesus's lament at the start. If only you knew the things that make for peace. Well, I think he's still crying as he looks down now upon his church and saying, if you only knew the things that make for peace, if you'd only embrace my approach to peacemaking. And so my hope is that after reading this book, people would be able to say, now I know the things that make for peace. And now I gladly and wholeheartedly seek to use and cultivate and employ Jesus's approach to peacemaking. So my hope is that this book will equip other Christians to faithfully and effectively serve as practitioners to cultivate shalom wherever it's painfully absent in our world.
Yeah, that's really great. That's really great. Jason, thank you so much for this. We've been on the line now for over an hour. I really appreciate the time you've taken. I'm so grateful for this book. This is one of my new favorites, and I think you've organized it really well. You've discussed it really well. You've invited us in as readers to be challenged, to be encouraged, to find hope where it seems dark and gloomy. So thank you so much for this.
Thank you, Joshua. Appreciated our conversation today.
So if there are people who want to find you or follow you, are you online, or where might be some places people could look you up?
Yeah, I'm on Facebook and Instagram. You can just search Jason Porterfield and you'll find me. But probably the main place is my website, jasonporterfield.com. You can actually get the first chapter, just to click a button and you'll get it right away, a PDF of it. If you want to read that first for Fight Like Jesus. And then I also on the homepage, if you scroll down, I have a free little ebook called 100 Early Christian Quotes on Not Killing. And it's just a one-page introduction and then 100 quotes. I just really wanted to let the early church speak for themselves on this matter. And so that resource is also available.
That is wonderful. I'll put a link to that in the podcast notes so listeners can find that. Well,
Great.
thank you
Thank you.
so much. I hope you have a fantastic rest of the day, great weekend, and as we head into Lent, I know this will be on the hearts and minds of a lot of people. So hopefully, Jesus will convey his peacemaking means through us all and challenge us and change us for his glory. So
Amen.
thanks a
Thanks,
lot.
Joshua.
Alrighty. Bye bye.
Bye.
You've been listening to Unbinding the Bible. If you find these episodes valuable and you haven't already done so, please leave a rating or review, or both, on whatever podcast app you choose to listen to these episodes. And then go and share one or more of your favorite episodes with a friend. You can also reach out to Joshua with any comments or questions to unbindingthebible@gmail.com. Thanks for listening and have a great week.